Valkie 64 is a game transparently inspired by Ocarina of Time and other classic Nintendo 64 titles. It's obvious from even a cursory glance. As such, we have an adventure game on our plate, one with splashes of 3D platforming, lots of sword combat, and some mild exploration elements. And I want to be very clear, the passion in this game is obvious. Someone really wanted to make Valkie 64, and I really wanted to like it. I hope, with that in mind, you'll understand how devastating it is that I find it to be quite bland. Firstly, Valkie's combat, which you spend most of your playtime engaged in, is a solved game in the worst way. Every enemy is weak to the same tactic. Swipe at them, dodge. Swipe at them, dodge. Even the bosses fall prey to this simple strategy, and it's the very first one I tried. Some encounters try to limit the space available to you, but it barely matters. I started the game out fighting every enemy obsessively, but quickly started to run past them, and eventually grew to dread mandatory fights. There's no critical thought necessary to succeed in sword fighting in Valkie. It's rather boring and one note. The bosses, by extension, are also some of the worst I've encountered. If you have even a basic understanding of moving a character around in 3D space, you've conquered these guys before you've even entered the room. It's jarring and comical, the dissonance between the game's expectations and the actual end result. The music for these dungeon-capping brawls is incredibly bombastic, the bosses themselves often have multiple phases and tons of visually overwhelming hazards littering the arena, but none of that matters. They're dead easy. As to the rest of the dungeon design, it's not much better than the combat. As soon as you walk into a room, you immediately know what's necessary to interact with and what isn't, which sucks all the fun right out of any puzzles presented to you. The layouts are also shockingly linear, with one, or rarely two, paths forward that are made dead obvious by the sheer number of locked doors. Some of the rooms were also so similar to one another that I had actual deja vu, which is a bad sign in a game this tightly focused. But what about the other Zelda stuff? The overworld and towns. I am glad to say, at least, that the overworld exploration, what little there is very pleasant. It rewards a keen eye and skilled player with heart pieces, which are the game's most common reward, but also its most valuable. But these side areas and alcoves are so few and far between that it's a bittersweet bright spot in the drudgery. Lastly, I suppose there are the towns. In Ocarina of Time, it was mandatory to interact with towns to some degree. It was a world-spanning adventure, after all, and you had to meet the local populace, rub elbows, and ask nicely to steal their ancient relics. In Valkie, it doesn't work that way. You can skip the towns entirely and just delve straight into the dungeons. Because of this, you can completely skip any context for the world, why it matters, or who you're even supposed to be saving in the first place. You can buy combat scrolls to enhance your movement, but nearly all of them just serve the purpose of making the fights even easier, which was not the problem. The problem is that the combat's so lifeless to begin with. Making it more mind-numbing doesn't help. I feel bad because I really wanted to like this game, and on first impressions I recommended it to a dear friend who loves Zelda. Unfortunately, it feels like a rough first pass at game design, not a grand adventure. I understand that this is an indie product and can't be directly compared to Ocarina of Time's scope, but as a work inspired by Ocarina of Time, it fails to include elements fundamental to Ocarina of Time's success, even though it seems to desperately want to include those.